Well, a whole lot rather talk about this material than to tell you about who I am. There are several people here who've known me for some time. Just a quick thing, it might have something to do with the way you listen to what I say, if I tell you. I'm a graduate of Lipscomb and then Harding Graduate School back in what my grandchildren regard as ancient history. And then I preached in Kansas 3 years. From there, the Hillsborough Church in Nashville, Tennessee asked us to be a part of their plans to start a church in northwest London. That was very unusual at that time for a church to decide a work it wanted to do and seek workers. It usually went the other way around. Workers decided where they wanted to go and seek churches to support them. But they stuck with us 10 and a half years and with that church, and that was in 1961. And in 2011, my wife and oldest daughter and I, the three of us who went over in 61, enjoyed going back over and helping them mark their 50th year. They've been self-supporting for a long time, a British preacher, very international church. At one point had people from 22 different nations, and that reflects London. I then was invited to come back and teach at Harding Graduate School. Taught a year or two and then went to Fuller and did what I guess was the first doctor's degree in missiology in our brotherhood. It was a very profitable time. Taught at Harding 21 and a half years, and 6 of those years I was dean. Then I went to Abilene to be chair of their missions department for 6 years, after which I retired from full-time teaching and have since devoted myself to part-time teaching and working with local churches. Because I concluded about 35 years ago, at least 35 years ago, that the weakest link in the missions enterprise of Churches of Christ is at the local church level. We're a church-sponsored missions people. We don't use missionary societies. And any church, and we're not the only church that does that, but any church that does that must recognize that all of the crucial decisions fall to the local church. Whatever's involved in selecting workers, sending them, supporting them emotionally as well as economically, evaluating their work appropriately, bringing them back when that's appropriate, all of that falls to the local church. And if the local church doesn't know how to do it, it just complicates the evangelistic task. So I've been doing workshops for churches. Wrote a handbook on missions for local churches. I have one copy with me, and it's not for sale. So I'm devoting a lot of my time now. I'm adjuncting a course here this semester. Last 2 fall semesters, I've adjuncted a course at Harding School of Theology in Memphis, trying to do some writing. I did put out that little book, Lest We Forget, to inspire people. When I went to Harding, Dr. W.B. West gave me a picture about this big that had 7 rows of 12 people, 84 pictures. He knew a few of them. He didn't know who put the picture out, didn't know when it came out. It was black and white, so it had to be dated. And turns out it came out in 1933 and was produced to hang in the foyer of church buildings and in people's homes to get them to pray for missions and to give money to support it. So it was a promotional piece. But I felt those people shouldn't be forgotten. I knew probably 8 or 10 of them, or knew of them. And so over a period of about 20 years, I collected information on each one of them, including the one child whose picture turned out to be Harry Robert Fox, who later worked in Japan. And I've enjoyed the reception that little book has received. Betty Choate published it. Now, to plunge into my material, what I have, about 40 minutes? Is that too much? It's not too much, okay. There's not a clock at the back, so you don't need to turn back and look at it. My daughter, who lives in Savannah, was worshiping down in Mississippi one time, and she said on the back of the church building there was a sign that said, "Remember Lot's wife." So you may know where that is. Okay, all of you have an outline. This is your take-home, boys and girls. How many are here from churches, just local churches, because of your interest? Good, very good. I'm so glad you're here. I assume the rest of you are students or faculty. I'll follow this fairly carefully because it's fairly extensive. I'll try to finish in time for you to ask questions. I'll be glad to do that. But if you really want me to clear up a point as we go along, if I'm just too obscure, then raise your hand and I'll be glad to entertain it. Several years ago, I heard that an executive for one of the missionary societies for the Independent Christian Church said he spent 95% of his time sorting out problems between the missionaries themselves rather than between the missionaries and the local culture. Well, I think there's a message in that. That may not be exceptional. We may know, and I could spend all of my time, I guess, talking about this, that Satan is very likely to try to interrupt efforts on the part of people to change their allegiance, to bring people under the dominion of Jesus Christ. We can expect Satan to cause some difficulty. It'll happen in a local church here if you're really doing a good job of reaching people and helping people to imbibe the Christian worldview. So this whole business of getting along and of having good relationships and guarding against Satan's interrupting them is a very big field. So we can think about missionaries and their relationship to their sending churches, the host government, to the host culture itself, relationship to fellow missionaries, to missionaries from other religious groups and missionary groups and group leaders. That is the missionary group of which you might be a part of a team. I'll give unequal emphasis to these because they deserve that. So first of all, missionaries and sending or supporting churches. This can be interrupted both because the missionaries don't communicate properly and because the churches don't communicate properly and because they don't have good front-end understandings. There can be misunderstandings regarding the task. For example, churches instinctively feel if we're supporting a missionary, he's over there to teach and baptize people. But he may get there and find out we're a long way from baptizing people here. If he goes to a Muslim country or a country that's really hostile, he's going to be laying a foundation. And if the church doesn't understand that, they get antsy and they want some results. I heard years ago, and this wouldn't happen in Alabama, I'm sure, of a missionary somewhere in the Pacific. And a church in Arkansas brought him and his wife home because they felt they weren't making very much progress. So he got back and spent a year or so with that church. And just looking through the church records, discovered that he and his wife in the South Pacific had taught and baptized more people than the entire church in Arkansas had. So they really didn't know how to assess the situation. If somebody needed to be fired or brought home, it might have been the supporting church because all of them together weren't doing as much, at least in hardline evangelism. So there can be misunderstandings there. Winning individuals or building up churches. Some congregations are happy when people simply report how many baptisms they have, without asking, okay, are you training them? Are you discipling them? Are you developing any leaders? Suppose you have to come home. Michael Brooks told me they had to come home a little early just now. What if it's a situation like Paul having to leave Thessalonica before he finished doing what he really wanted to do with them? And time and again he wanted to go back, but he said in 2 Thessalonians that Satan hindered him. And that's 1 Thessalonians. He said, finally, when I could stand it no more, I sent Timothy to find out how you're getting along. What are you going to leave behind? I know some missionaries who worked up in El Patan in Guatemala, the northern part. They started 5 churches, and they had a routine that they followed. And then the guerrilla activity erupted, and they all had to leave quickly. And they wondered, like Paul, I wonder how those churches are getting along. Turns out 4 of them survived. The only one that didn't was the one that was most recent. They had to leave it. Well, what do churches expect to happen? That might not be the same thing as the missionaries find out. So here are these things. Now, misunderstandings can be regarding expectations of the sending church. Missionaries can expect more emotional and spiritual support than they received. They're expecting the church to keep up with issues like exchange rates and money. I heard just this week that this is a good time to make a trip to Europe if anybody's inclined to do it. because right now the dollar is almost equal with a euro. And it's been that you had to spend quite a bit more than $1 to get a euro. Those exchange rates. I was with the Park Avenue Church in Memphis, and we sent Wes Harrison to work in Germany. The first year he was there, between German inflation and the weakness of the dollar against the Deutschmark, he lost 25% of his buying power. Would you like to take a 25% cut in pay? So who was responsible for taking care of that? Well, we were as a church. We're the ones who are supposed to keep up with that. So what we finally did was said, look, how much will it take you to live there? How many Deutschmarks? I said, okay, you will get that many Deutschmarks every month. It doesn't matter what it costs us to do it. You will have that many Deutschmarks. It was our responsibility as a church to be sensitive to the exchange, the varying exchange rates. Because I've known missionaries who really had to scrape the bottom because their supporting churches didn't understand that. That complicates relationships. Sometimes political situations. The church down at Forest Park in Georgia was sort of the sponsor of a team that worked on the south side of Buenos Aires when Argentina went to war with Great Britain over the Malvinas, over the Falkland Islands. And the parents of those missionaries were very concerned. Are our children safe? Well, there wasn't going to be any war there. I mean, the United States decided for some reason to side with Great Britain. I don't know why our government had to say anything at all about that, because it was, from the British point of view, a storm in a teapot. There was no problem. I told some people to be about like Margaret Thatcher, to take the islands and then give it to them and say, we can give it to you, but you're not going to take it because precedent is involved here. But at any rate, the Forest Park elders were in touch with the State Department 6 days a week to find out, are these missionaries in any danger? And they then let the families know. And that was a very good move on their part. So there's several solutions to the complicated, or to have good relationships between churches and those whom they support. One, have good front-end agreements. It's advisable to have, I don't like the term contract. That sounds too much like an employee in IBM. But I do like the concept of a ministry covenant. Have a ministry covenant. What the church agrees to do and what the missionaries agree to do. And that's sort of a covenant between the two. And each knows what to expect of the other. And then when the missionaries come home after the first tour of duty, if we may put it that way, sit down and revise that thing. When missionaries go out first, they need to learn the culture. And if they don't know the language, they really need to buckle down and learn the language. Well, as time goes on, they need to spend less time learning the language and more time really working. So they need to redefine what their role will be in terms of a kind of ministry covenant. If you will look at on page, let's see, what would it be? Page 3? No, page 4. There's a little chart here that our brother Dan Hardin developed. And the timeline moves from left to right. And you see the white area is the area of individual responsibility. And the bottom part, the shaded part, is the area of church responsibility. And when they, here's some possible relationships where the missionary is pretty well independent. See, the church doesn't play much of a role. Then there can be the case where the church knows enough about missions to endorse the plans that are made by the missionary. They don't make many of those plans, they just sort of rubber stamp it. A lot of churches do that because they haven't developed an understanding of the task. An ideal thing is a partnership where the church understands enough about what goes on in missions and the missionaries understand enough about it to where they can sit down and partner in developing the way they're going to go about the task. And then there can be cases where a church knows more about the work than a new missionary does, and so they can sort of supervise them. This can be true when you have interns on the field, that a church is going to support them, and they say, now you need to work with local missionaries. They need to provide your daily schedule, and about 18 hours out of the day, you work under their direction. That's where they're seeing to it that supervision takes place. And there are some churches that have a long history with an area, like Forest Park in Atlanta has a long history with some of the islands in the South Pacific. The Central Church in Amarillo, Texas developed real expertise on the country of Brazil. So they pretty well knew what people needed to be successful in Brazil, and they were able to do some supervision work on the front end. And then there are some cases where a church knows enough about it that they need to send some workers in and tell them what to do. We've been there a long time. Now the ideal is in the middle, the partnership, where churches have understanding, missionaries have understanding. So that's worthwhile out of that little thing. So having good front-end agreements is very important, and B, have a good, reliable contact person through whom to communicate. If somebody is far away in Burma or some other such place, and things happen, the man's wife becomes desperately ill. They have a child who's suffered some sort of accident, and they need to do. There needs to be one person who is easily contactable by the missionaries. That gives them a sense of peace to know that I have the email address. I can do this or that or the other. I know how to text them or whatever, so I can get in touch with that person immediately, 24 hours a day. That's a very great sense of assurance for a person. And the fact that that can happen really produces better relationships. Second, missionaries' relationship with the host culture. It's fairly elementary that when we move to another country, we need to get a visa. All countries do not require that. Sometimes you just have to go in as a visitor because they won't give missionary visas. About half of the unreached countries of the world will not allow, their countries where we have churches, they will not give missionary visas at all. So people have to go in other capacities, medical workers, agricultural helpers, education, and all of that. Now, they're tent makers, in other words. Or if they go in working as a school teacher or something else, then they can evangelize that way, but because they won't get a visa. And when you try to go around some of that, you can get into a lot of trouble. So getting visas or work permits, registering with the police, providing some kind of service to the country, avoiding local politics, financial issues, and so forth. Pay attention to what their regulations are. One ignores these to one's peril, and you can get kicked out of the country unnecessarily. So be savvy. Now the exception to this is where you manage to get into a country where they don't want you to preach the gospel, or where they may not want you there. And so there have been times when our people have smuggled in Bibles. Of course, radio and Bible correspondence courses are wonderful ways to penetrate countries that are what are called limited access countries. It's just limited how far you can get access, because the gospel needs to go to the whole world regardless of what governments say. But as far as possible, we need to work within the framework. Romans 13 is important, and you read that on the other side of the world the way you read it here. The powers that be are ordained of God. And I know we may not like some of those, but God controlled Nebuchadnezzar. He controlled Cyrus. He did what he wanted to do with Pharaoh. God is sovereign. And those people whom he controls are not all righteous. In fact, Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar that he'd have to eat grass like an ox until he learned that the Most High rules in the kingdoms of men, and to raise up over them even the lowest of men. Daniel 4:25. And that's true. So there's one thing worse than bad government. That's no government, because you then have chaos, and it's a horrible situation. But it's important to work within those things. When we went to England, we were required to register with the local police because we were aliens. And my wife said that hit her like, I'm an alien? Well, yeah, I guess I am. I'm not British, so I'm an alien here. So we registered with the police. And it's often to your advantage to know that, or for them to know that, and to register with your embassy. Quickly, here's some solutions. Learn in advance what's expected of expatriates. Keep up with any required registrations. Use care in communicating, that is email, phone calls, printed matter, about the local government. That is what we're going to say about the government. Some people, at least more in the past than now, have had to write almost a code language from China and certain other countries when people have been in Saudi Arabia and some of those areas that are strongly Muslim. They pretty well have to write in a kind of code language just to avoid being misunderstood. Because a lot of times people put the Chinese would put all missionaries in the category of Roman Catholics who want to control the government and all of that sort of thing. So we have to be careful that our vision of ourselves is not other people's view of us from time to time. Let the U.S. Embassy know that you're there and your address. You may need them. You may need them. Everett Hufford, that's the father. Everett and Elsie worked in Jerusalem before the 6-Day War. Everett Wayne was a 7th grader at that time, and Elaine was younger. And the U.S. government knew that there was going to be some war. And they told them, you have 12 hours to have 2 suitcases each and get to the airport. We're flying you to Athens. That was before the 6-Day War. They needed for the embassy to know where they were and had their phone number and all of that. And our U.S. Embassy is very good at taking care of citizens. So they're your friend, and it's important to let them know who you are. Maintain ethics in regard to finances. Been questioned about black market exchanging of money or legitimate exchanges. Just use good ethics in those regards. Third, missionaries in the host culture. At times, potential missionaries leave for the field before they're really ready to engage in another culture. We've talked a lot about this in my course on global evangelism that I've been teaching here this semester. Because when you cross a cultural line, that's a new dimension. And you're the guest in another country. So you need to, when churches need to be sure that missionaries who are going to another culture have at least minimal training in how cultures function, and that they're the foreigner, and that they need to follow the model of Jesus, who, when he came to the earth, came as a Palestinian. Paul uses that in Philippians 2 to talk about a humble mindset. But that's a good model, the incarnation model. The bridge was built from heaven to earth, not the other way around. And so we're the ones who are to build a bridge to those cultures, not expect them to think like an American and learn English and all that sort of thing. So I think we owe it to the people whom we're trying to bring to Christ to see to it that the workers we send have some minimal understanding about how to get along with the culture. If they don't, they can suffer culture shock. And I like to make a distinction between culture shock and culture jolt. You're always going to have some jolt when you go to another culture. Things are packaged differently, they eat that, and so on and so forth. They dress funny and talk funny and look funny and all of that. Those are all ethnocentric things. But you know, that's the dimple of the universe to them. And so we need to learn how things make sense to them. But we're always going to have some little jolts like that, but culture shock immobilizes you. This must have been 25 years ago. A couple were supported in Brazil from a town here in Alabama. They didn't have proper prayer. He was apparently a good preacher locally, but he wasn't prepared to go to another culture. He's working alongside a man who was supported by a church in New Mexico. After 1 year, there were 2 of the elders from the church in New Mexico that went down there to see how things were going with their man, and they saw the plight of this poor fellow. He lived in a fairly large house. He was not learning Portuguese. He paid a woman to go out and shop, get groceries for them. He was absolutely paralyzed. He couldn't do anything and didn't know what was happening to him. So when the elders got back to New Mexico, they called the elders here in Alabama and said, "Have you had good contact with your man?" Said, "We support so-and-so who works with him." And no, so he's just a good brother, and we sent him down to evangelize those people. So, well, we've just been down there. I think it'd be a good idea if you just sort of look in on him and talk to him on the phone. So, well, they did, and found out the poor fellow was paralyzed. He was suffering abject culture shock. And so they had to bring him back. Now, that kind of scenario is absolutely preventable. Absolutely preventable. If people say, now, you want to go to Timbuktu, and there is such a place. I'd like to go to Timbuktu. It's in Mali. Have you studied anything about culture? Have you had a missions course? Have you read anything? The Ugly American. Have you read any books on this? You owe it to them to insist that they get minimal training, or they will not make it in most cases. Just they don't know what's happening to them. That's relating to the host culture. The missionaries need to make cultural preparations so they will come to understand and accept different ways of life, except when those differences involve sin. If a new missionary does not like local people or their way of doing things, local people will detect it. They'll pick up on it. If you feel superior, if you feel that that's stupid, they will sense that. On the other hand, if you understand, it's very different from the way we did it back in Alabama and Tennessee and Arkansas. I don't see why they do that. I don't see. You go and you're judgmental about people who drive on the left-hand side of the road or eat with chopsticks or with their fingers or whatever. That makes perfect sense to them, just like eating a knife and fork does to you. And if you go and you understand why they do that, they will perceive that and you'll get along much better with them. Solutions. The sending church should make sure the potential missionaries have gone through some kind of cultural preparation. Several helps are available. There are good books and articles, workshops, courses in our colleges and universities and preacher training schools. There are resource persons who can be helpful. And there are several helpful emotional inventories that can be taken to indicate how flexible or rigid a person is. If a potential missionary, no matter how good his or her heart is one of those inflexible personalities, rigid personalities, they will not adjust very well. They wouldn't adjust very well if they went from Alabama to Southern California. Years ago, I heard of a preacher who went to a small town in West Tennessee to hold a meeting. He stayed in a small hotel, took his meals there in the hotel. But every morning it was a different scenario. One day the waitress brought his food and he said, "Wait a minute." And so he took his knife and fork and cut it like that and turned his plate and cut it like that and then heaped it up and said, "Here, take it. See if you can get a dog to eat it. That's not what I ordered." And it was a different scenario every morning. At the end of the week, the proprietor of the hotel talked to one of the elders of the church and he said, "I don't know whether you want to have this man back for another revival or not. But if you do, we'd appreciate it if you'd put him up somewhere else if we never were able to please him." Now that's sort of bad for the local church, but that kind of guy will not make it in another culture. He's not always going to get his eggs the way he wants them. It's just not structured that way. And there are little mechanisms that people who teach counseling here or psychology, little mechanisms they can use in MPI and some of the other inventories to find out whether you're flexible or pretty rigid. And if you're terribly rigid, you're probably going to have trouble getting along at home too. But you don't want that kind of person to go to another country where the name of the game is being flexible. Not becoming sinful, but to say, I can exercise a lot of options here for the sake of preaching the gospel to people. 1 Corinthians 9, Paul said, "I have a lot of freedom, but I'm going to forego that freedom for the sake of reaching people." And that's when, Jew I became as a Jew, to those that are without law, and so on. Become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. He's not talking about compromising ethics. He's talking about some of these other behavior things that are sort of optional. And that's the kind of thing we have to have. Missionaries' relationship with fellow missionaries. This obviously involves situations where several families or individuals are working together, or at least close enough to have interactions. I've known several missionaries who did their best work as lone wolves. They were just people who needed to be in the saddle, and they worked better alone, or a man and his wife. Our brotherhood is learning that our people are likely to stay on the field longer and be more productive if you go as a team, because you have different abilities on teams. You can cover more bases and different kind of bases. You can strengthen one another. I remember that team in southern Buenos Aires I was telling you about, the Forest Park Church sponsor. Stephen Teal, who was one of the workers, said, every one of us at one time or another has been at the bottom of the barrel. I mean, they went to Costa Rica to learn Spanish, and they developed diarrhea, and it just stayed with them for two years or so. Well, that's a debilitating kind of situation, just emotionally down. One couple wanted to have a child, never could conceive, and just one thing after another. At one time or another, he said, every one of us was at the bottom of the barrel, but there was never a time when the whole team was at the bottom of the barrel. There was always somebody who could sort of lift you up, and they had different strengths. Who's going to help in developing hymnody, Christian hymnody? Not all missionaries have musical facility. So it's good to have some of these bases covered and know who's the detail fellow here, who's the guy who's a visionary, and so on. So there's a whole block of thought to this business of building teams. Now, Missions Resource Network, whose address I've given at the end of this, does a good job of coaching people in developing teams. There are places where teams can go and work through it. And Harding School of Theology has done some of it, Harding University, Abilene, I think maybe some of it at Freed as well, where you bring some counselors in and others to see how well these people get along. They need to be in different circumstances to see how they relate to each other. And to keep good relationships, they need to guard themselves, be willing to forgive, be willing to overlook some mistakes. When somebody's having a bad day and just says things that are off, they're not guarded and so on. Avoid envy, arrogance, gossip, pride, hypercriticism, and so forth. Guard yourself sexually. It's a terribly traumatic thing for everybody involved. Supporting churches, the mission team, and the people that they're teaching when a team breaks up. It breaks up on the field. That's very traumatic for, it seems, everybody involved. Inter-family problems spill over into the group. Unfortunately, there are people who've had family problems and they feel if they become missionaries, they would heal them. Well, any kind of tension or difficulty we have now, unresolved problems with parents, unresolved problems between a man and a wife, terrible trouble with teenagers and so forth, all of those problems tend to be exacerbated in another culture when you're in a more stressful situation. So those things need to be sorted out before you go. Wait a year before going. Churches need to hear this. If there's any irregularity like that, work through it. Potentially good workers can have difficulties. But if there are solutions to those difficulties, good. Let's take the time to work through them. Team members and their sponsoring churches must have good understanding of what the team plans to do. I've known of some cases where one church that supported one couple decided they wanted their man to start a radio program. Well, that wasn't a part of the team plan at all. It just interrupts it. So where you have a team and several churches that are supporting people, all of those churches need to be on the same wavelength, just like the team needs to be on the same wavelength. They need to have a work plan that's written up so that churches and the workers can all buy into that. We talk about it being on the same page. They should associate with each other and undergo enough evaluations to know that they are likely to get along. Need to share activities other than church activities. Go on picnic, camping, things like that. There are means available for team building, and you can read that. There is a thing called DISC, a DISC program that refers to development. It's developed by the business people. It has to do with dominance, influence, steadiness, and conscientiousness. Business developed this because there are a lot of business things where people have to work together as teams, in the business world. And so it's important to them to pull together people who can get along with each other. If there's one bad apple there, it really complicates the whole thing. So they developed this thing so they could understand each other. I mean, members of the team need to understand who has dominance here. Who's that steadfast person going to stick with it through thick and thin? Who's going to be so terribly conscientious? It's just important to know that about each other so that you can go with your strengths and minimize your weaknesses. And that's been used effectively at times in working with mission teams. It's good, I added point number 5 to my notes, it's good to have some facility with conflict resolution or dispute resolution. It's just important to recognize that having conflict is a part of the human experience. It doesn't mean that people are sinful just because they see things differently. I'm not talking about doctrinal things that are regulated by Scripture, but which hymn book do you prefer? I mean, people differ on that. Now, what kind of hymns do you like best? And what color should the carpet be on the church? But you'd be surprised, maybe you won't, at how much tension can be developed in churches over silly things like what color the carpet ought to be. It doesn't matter to colorblind people anyway, and outsiders may not notice it. They're more concerned about you than they are what you walk on. But people will let things like that really interrupt their work. But having conflict, and there's an enormous amount of information on this. Lipscomb, because Dr. Randy Lowry is there, he developed a Center for Dispute Resolution when he was out at Pepperdine. He's a lawyer. And there are several of these workshops that people can go to on conflict resolution. And it's been a great relief to churches when I've taught them on this. Say, you are not sinful just because you have some conflict, but it might become sinful if you don't manage it properly. So how do you manage conflict so that it can become fruitful rather than destructive? So what you want to do is to move it toward resolution rather than letting it go into chaos. And to have a little bit of facility with that, how to process things of which we see differently, we find. The big team that went to Sao Paulo, Brazil in 1961 followed Robert's Rules of Order. I don't know that I think that's always best for a mission team, but that's what they followed, so that the majority sort of ruled. I had a team of fellows that trained at Harding Graduate School who went to Campo Grande, Brazil, several years later. And they picked up, they had all had some counseling courses, but they picked up on a thing that occurs mostly in the book of Acts. It's a Greek word, homothumadon, which is usually translated one-mindedness, be of one accord. Remember that occurring? They were all of one accord and so forth. They said, we want to work toward that biblical idea. So if we lined up like 3 against 2 in preferring something, we decided we're going to back off, we're going to pray about it, and we're going to determine that we'll give and take because we want to be of one mind on this. That's what God wants us to do. That needs to be a good example to the local church, and it's the way we'll do it. Well, 3 or 4 years into that, I asked Eugene Godot, I said, how does your little scheme work about working for one mind? He said, it works beautifully. It works beautifully. People ought to see things differently. I had a secretary in Memphis, Jane Tomlinson, whose son was one of the vice presidents of the PepsiCo company. He told his mother once, he said, Mom, I dare not hire people who will do just what I want them to do, people who are like me. He said, I've got to have people there who think differently from me, or we're going to be weak. I don't have all the good ideas, and some of my ideas are not good at all. So I've got to have people different from myself. I think that's a very healthy way of looking at it. People who see differently on things, then work through it. Don't feel defensive, just work through it. People just will see differently. They might be right. Number 5, missionaries' relationships with missionaries from other groups. Let me say on the front end, if the salt stays in the salt shaker, it's not going to be very influential. And we're there to teach the gospel to people who don't know it. But you can probably learn some things from people who've been there a long time before you. What do you do if you have a Baptist missionary who's been there 20 years? He's learned something about the culture. And often when you get on the mission field, people are pretty embarrassed at some of their denominational names. And I don't think we've nothing to be ashamed there. Just Christians, we're members of Christ Church. And not insisting on one name. When I was at Fuller, I had some courses with a Japanese fellow who had gone to the Cumberland Theological Seminary, Cumberland Presbyterian Theological Seminary in Memphis Theological Seminary. And I thought when I was there, boy, even if I were Japanese, I would not want to be charged with the responsibility of trying to get Japanese people to become Cumberland Presbyterians. Would you? I have a little book called Report from Many Fields. It's published by Moody Press up in Chicago. Not a member of the church writes to it. It came out about 1960. And there's a fellow in there who done mission work in Brazil. It tells about people in northern Brazil having difficulty understanding why they needed to be Southern Baptists. See, northern, southern, that's an American Civil War division. That makes no sense in northern Brazil. Dr. Don McGavran tells about those pan-denominational conferences in India where the various brands of Lutheran get together and say, well, we're Missouri Synod, what are you? Well, we're this other and the American and so on. About 3 or 4, we're Scandinavian. They're all Lutheran, but they've got these different names, none of which really make sense to people in India. So a lot of times they find what we say quite appealing. And sometimes we have an opportunity to talk to those people at a level that is not possible here in the USA. So I think there's some advantages in talking to those people. We can learn from them, and they will probably learn something from us. I've had missionaries to drool over the situation under which I worked. I said, well, I'm supported by one church. They asked me to be a part of their work. I go back home and I stick my feet under their table and I eat with them and talk to them. And they tell me it's rare for us to have a public assembly where somebody doesn't mention your work in prayer. And they say, my. The only person I know is our field secretary. I don't know who gives us money. You know, they rather like church-sponsored mission approach. They think that makes a lot of sense. So we have a chance to do some teaching there. We have a chance to learn some things. We just have to be careful that we not have a joint worship service where we're likely to compromise something that we don't feel. And they'll understand that because they can conceive of, a Southern Baptist may not be happy having a joint worship, but a Pentecostal church. They understand that. So we can still maintain friendships and not compromise the truth. But that relationship can cause difficulty back home. Well, since Churches of Christ hold this church-sponsored approach, it means that the responsibilities for selecting workers and maintaining workers and evaluating falls to the local church. I spent quite a bit of my time helping churches to work through that and do a better job of it. And delighted at the outcome that can take place. On page 5, I've given you resources. I think my time's about up. So Howard Norton's little book, The Eldership of the Missionaries, is a short little book, and it's very well worth reading by people who are involved in the missions committee. Neil Parolo, he's an evangelical, but serving as senders. Most of what he says you shouldn't do, we can resonate with that. He said, don't give missionaries pets. I mean, can't take a little puppy dog into Great Britain. They put it in quarantine for 3 months and all that kind of stuff. Surprising what people would do, meaning very well, but it's just inappropriate. Then there's Missions Handbook for Local Churches, Missions Resource Network, operated by our brethren down in Texas, asked me to write that because for 35 years I taught these various things. It's a little over 100 pages. You can look at a copy here if you want and order it. I get no money out of it. I gave it to them to help their efforts. But that's designed to help a church from beginning point to adequacy, if they will work through that. Then Galen Van Reen and Bob Waldron, two of our brothers, wrote this book, The Status of Missions, a Nationwide Survey of Churches of Christ. back in 2002, and I suspect most of their conclusions are true today, except the statistics, about what were the patterns of behavior among churches that really did a good job of sponsoring missions. Well, we might have time for just a few questions if anybody has any. Yes, Michael?
The longer I visit the same areas and the more the churches mature and individuals mature, the more I become aware that one of my challenges is to watch carefully my relationship with local leaders and to recognize the partnership that we have and be humble in that. Do you have any special suggestion? I know that was a category you didn't have, but the missionary, once the church becomes established.
Yes, that's right. I would generally place that under the business of how do we develop churches. But that's just another relationship. What is your ongoing relationship with the church that you started 5, 10 years down the road? At times, missionaries have made churches dependent upon them. And that's a mistake. We need to move from the initial mentoring process, get it started. You have to wear most of the hats. And then you begin to train them. And it's good when you can get into a partner relationship, then to the point to where you can sort of withdraw and you're a visitor a little later. That's a discerning thing. You need to go through that process. And that's more the long range kind of thing. I'm supposed to talk about this in the forthcoming India mission workshop. How do you work to have churches that can stand on their own? And if we don't do that, we make them exceedingly vulnerable. One quick question on this, Glenn Swartz, whom I met in Fuller, is a member of the Brethren in Christ, Division of the Mennonites, worked in East Africa 30-some years. He told of a North American evangelical group that was trying to help a church in Guyana, northern coast of South America. So they collected their money and went down there. They looked around and they bought a piece of property. They looked at the kind of church buildings people were building, and they decided what this one would look like. And they bought the materials with the money they brought with them. And local people pitched in and did some of the work. But they finished it with spiritual fanfare, turned it over to this local little group, and left. And a little time passed. Schwartz didn't fill in all the details, but after a few years passed, got a letter one time, got several letters, but got this letter, told about this and that, and said, oh, by the way, the roof on your church building is leaking. You need to come down and repair it. Whose building was it? The people in the States. There was no ownership to that. That's what he's talking about. But if you can develop people early, turn things over to them, pat them on the back, and give them encouragement, and sort of guide them so they develop confidence, you're doing them a favor.
What I had in mind was more individual relationships with people. You like to have individual relationships with your teammates and congregation. I've had both extremes. People who want you to do everything and fund everything and make all the decisions, and people who will say in your face, you stay home, send us money, let us do the work. Those are two extremes.
That's
and
right.
I think the middle ground is probably a lot of
I think that's right. That's good observation. We need to learn from our experiences. Somebody said for teaching and mission work and preaching and a lot of other things, it's one thing to have 10 years experience. It's another thing to have 2 years experience 5 times. Some people sort of do their learning the first 2 years and they don't progress from that. We used to say put the needle down and play the record. By the way, the finals are coming back, aren't they? Now we push the button and play the thing. No, we need to keep on learning and being discerning. After being there a few years, then we're in a position to ask the right questions. And very, very good relationship with local leaders. So you turn them into, first, discipling them, you sort of become partners, and then they become leaders. And cultures there are some cultures that are just dependent. I mean, people who have done a lot of work in India know that when they work with the Dalits, that is a dependent culture. And that's one reason why some of the Hindus are persecuting Christians. They don't like Christians to come in and evangelize those people because their voting allegiance has changed once they become Christians. And they're teaching them, you're a valid human being. You don't have to live as somebody else's slave. You're a valid human being. And but that culture teaches them to be dependent on somebody else. Well, you can expect that in the church, and it takes more time to stabilize a church in a circumstance like that than it does in a culture where there are people who are leaders and take responsibility. Another question? You want to ask something later, or if you want to send me an email, my email address is at the bottom. If you want a sample of a ministry covenant, I'll try to send you one of those with the names taken out, money and all of that. Okay. Whoever's in charge, here's the brother. He made himself, who's going to be in charge? Joey, Harvey.
Thank you so much. You are a wise man, and I really appreciate everything that you had to say. That was very good. We could just sit here and listen to you talk all night. Very, very good. I'll give you the quote from the back. My wife comes in. She was her daughter had a soccer game, so that finished up a little bit later than we thought. She comes in and she sits down and she says, "Who's this sweet man? I like him." So there we go. I want to give a quick commercial for the 9th annual Maywood Missionary Retreat. There are brochures all over the place on all these tables back here. Get you one. It's got the schedule of all the events on the inside. I'm not going to go through all that for the sake of time. But anyway, just pick one of these up if you can get down there to Maywood on that weekend. It's April 30th through May the 2nd. Actually, most of it's going to be April 30th and May 1st. May 2nd, we're just getting up and going home. So don't plan on coming down on that Saturday. Saturday, you're just getting up, eating breakfast, and going home. So anyway, it's going to be really, really good. It's always good. We learn a lot. We get to hear from lots of wise men and get to hear their experiences with mission work, and we get to learn from each other. And at the same time, we get to relax. It's a good, relaxing time. We get to talk to other missionaries, and it's just a good time. So anybody that wants to come to that, pick up one of those brochures, check it out, and we hope to see you down there. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jeremy. I'll give a real short introduction. He's my baby brother. I always have to say that before he speaks, but I love to hear Jeremy speak. He always makes my brain work, and he just about every time makes my brain explode with lots of great ideas, and I'm really interested to hear what he has to say on this topic. So I will not take up any more time. If you must take a break, I'm sorry, you'll have to take a break in the middle of Jeremy's talk. So I apologize. Oh, you want to take a 5-minute break? Okay, I'm sorry. We're going to take a 5-minute break. The boss has spoken, but it's just 5 minutes because we want to make sure we get y'all out here at 8 o'clock. Okay, 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Appreciate Dr. Slate and his presentation and his many, many good thoughts. I hope to build upon these things tonight. Thank you all for your attendance. Thank you for being here, and I hope that some of the things that we have to say will be valuable and encouraging to you. And then hopefully we'll have time for just a few questions and answers or discussion, that sort of thing. I don't know how many of you, I may have just lost half of you talking about The Hobbit up here, okay? But I don't know how many of you have read this book, but a good friend of mine who's now preaching at a congregation in England where you established that congregation, his name is Nathan Guy. He gave me this book in December of 2001, and he gave it to me about 20 days after my first child was born, and he gave this actually to my son. It says, "For Samuel to develop a sense of wonder and a desire to dream." I remember reading this book when I was in about 5th grade, and my son read it when he was about in 5th grade, and my daughter's reading it with me right now, and she's in 5th grade. And one of the reasons I brought this book up to you tonight is because I really enjoy, if you haven't read the book, there's also the movie as well, But I really enjoy the character of Bilbo because Bilbo is this guy, he's a homebody, and he has no desire to go anywhere. And then all of a sudden, adventure comes knocking on his door, and he's sort of compelled to go on this journey. And just last night, I was reading with my daughter where he's halfway around the world, and he's trying to fall asleep on the side of a mountain, and he's freezing. And he says, you know, they're harvesting right now back home. You know, and he's thinking about all of the fall festivals that are about to start, and he just wants to go home. And so I like the book because what happens to Bilbo in the book is something that's really important. And this is, I was trying to think about the way that many of us sometimes approach missions. If it's not something that we're encouraged to do or we've seen from experience from family or friends, it's not something we're likely to do. So I may be speaking or preaching to the choir, so to speak, and that you have an interest in this. But if you don't have an interest, it's one that has to be fostered. You understand what I'm saying here? You're not going to be inclined to say, you know what, I want a little adventure. Well, I grew up seeing and experiencing what you might call adventure. And generally speaking, travel would fit into that category. You're going to see things and experience things that you wouldn't necessarily experience at home. And so it's very difficult to get us from being the person who's a homebody to taking the gospel to the world. And the reason this is important is for the reason that the very people who send us may be the people who don't want to go. And it's not because they don't believe in the mission. Do you understand what I'm saying? It has nothing to do with whether or not you believe in it or not. It has nothing to do with it. But you're trying to communicate ideas, you're trying to talk about cultures that people will likely never see or experience firsthand. Now, I have to admit, this is actually getting easier and easier day by day. Why? Because modern communications, modern television. You know, I mean, just in this room tonight, how many nations are represented here? We have Argentina, we have the Philippines, we have the United States, we have Antigua. Okay, you see what I'm saying? So, now understand we're at Heritage Christian University, and maybe that gives us a little, you know, we might have a few more here than many places. But, you know, by and large, this is changing pretty quickly, isn't it? What that means is we're actually beginning to have more cultures converge pretty dramatically. And we'll talk about that just a little bit more in a minute. But I'm trying to get you to get excited about going. So let's see here. Let me tell a quick story. I guess it was about 9 years ago that I had a chance to go with my wife and 2 children. And my parents, we were part of a group, a fellowship that I'd gotten to go to Italy and Greece. And part of this trip, we had gone to Rome and seen a lot of these places around there and Florence. And the time came for my family to have to leave. And I had already traveled quite a bit, and so I felt comfortable traveling on my own for a few days in Italy before I joined back with the group, and we were going to go on over to Greece. And I had studied Italian for 6 months, and I knew that I didn't know Italian, but I knew enough to be able to read signs and order at restaurants and do things like that. And so I felt okay about it. And so, anyway, I was going to go to Pompeii. I had about a day and a half, 2 days. I wanted to see Pompeii while I was there. There was some artwork that I wanted to see on a wall and other things. And so I had enough time. I'd already gotten recommendations from people who had been there. I knew where I was staying. It was already booked online, you know. And so I was headed down there. And I took off on a train. I said bye to my family and my parents and inwardly wept as I saw them head off to the airport. And so I got on my train and went on down. It was another hour and a half or so to Naples. And I got off the train, and what I knew I was going to do was I was going to go, there's a regional train. And so I went, and it's in the same train station. So I felt, well, this won't be that hard, you know. I don't even have to leave the train station, and I can transition. And that train will take me directly to Pompeii, and I'll get off and go to my hotel. I'll be in my hotel 7:30, plenty of time to find something to eat, you know. So I get off the train, and I walk up to this big board that had all the times, you know, all the schedules on it. And I start trying to read it. And it was kind of complicated. So I stood there and I read it. And I was reading it and reading it. Well, about an hour later, I'm still standing there, and I'm trying to read this station. And one of the things about Italy is it's one of these places where nobody really cares about speaking English. So you could go around going, English, and you're going to have a hard time actually finding anybody who, even if they know it, it's not like they're going to go, yeah, I speak English. So I'm standing there looking at this train station, and there's only one thing that I really understand about the train station, that is the times. And like the last train is in 20 minutes, and I know for certain that that's the case. I just can't figure out which train to get on. And so I'm reading it, and so finally we're down to the last 3 trains, and I know it. And so I just go down to the tracks, I buy a ticket, and so one train pulls up here, one train pulls up here, and I've got to get on one or the other. It's either this or I'm going to spend the night at the train station. I don't want to do that. And so both of the doors open at the same time, and I jump on this train, and I look at somebody and go, Pompeii? Pompeii? And they go, Pompeii. And so I jump off, and I run over to the other train, and I get on it, and I go, Pompeii? And they go, Pompeii. And so that was how I made the decision, And so we're going down the tracks. Now the problem was this. There was Pompeii, and then there was Pompeii Scavi. Now, do y'all realize what the difference is? Okay. Well, I'd studied enough Italian, but not enough. I'd studied a little bit, but not enough. Scavi means excavation. So one Pompeii is a modern city, and the other one is the excavation site. And I didn't know which one to go on, and it was 2 different trains. Okay. So what I knew was there was a certain point where the tracks would split, and once they had split, I would know whether or not I'd made the right decision. And that was about 30 minutes down. Well, we make the split, and guess what? I'm on the wrong tracks. And so I'm like, well, I get off at the next station because there is a train coming the other way. I'm like, well, I'd figured it all out, how plan A, B, C, and D, and that sort of thing. And so I got on the next train that came about 45 minutes later to that station. There was nobody there. There was nobody at the station, And so I just get off and get on the next one, and nobody there. It's getting dark by now. And I get on the train, and it does take me in the right direction, sort of. And I finally get off at this spot. And best I can tell, I should be about a 20-minute walk to my hotel. Now, one thing that I had done when my parents left was I volunteered to take my kids' luggage with me. So I had my luggage, plus I had my kids' luggage. And if you're in an airport and pulling on concrete, that works okay. But when you know how they pave roads in Italy? It's all these little individual stones. It's not paved at all. And so I'm kind of just clunking, So anyway, now it's about 8:30 at night. I get out of the train station. I'm at the wrong Pompeii. I'm walking about 20, 25 minutes, depending on my pace, if it's a good pace. So I'm trying to walk fast, and I'm basically dragging a suitcase. And so about 30 minutes later, I'm still dragging a suitcase. It's completely dark. And then I hear something behind me, and I look around. I've got a dog with me. So this dog is just walking with me, and he goes with me for about 15 minutes. And so I'm just sweating up a storm with all this luggage. But this time it's about 9 o'clock at night, and I'm starting to get worried. And this is not necessarily advisable, but a couple pulls up beside me who speaks English, and they say, "You need a ride?" And I say, "Yes, I could use a ride." And the crazy thing was I was headed to in Italian, the Via dei Misteri, the House of the Mysteries. Doesn't this sound like just a great place to be headed to? Well, it's actually named after a part of Pompeii. That's where it gets its name. So there's a hotel right next to Pompeii named after a part of Pompeii. That's where I'm going. This couple picks me up, drives me up there. The dog leaves me. And they drop me off around 9:45 at night. I walk up to the front booth. I'm just thrilled to death. By the way, this hotel is not near anything. It's kind of on the far end of Pompeii. And so I walk up to the man up front, and I say, "Here, I've got a reservation." "Okay, let me see your passport." I give him my passport. He says, "You don't have a reservation here." I was like, "You're kidding." And I pull out, all of these papers and that sort of thing. Well, The night actually, well, I'll tell you just a little bit more and then I'll stop the story and it'll make the point, okay? So I'm like, what do you mean I don't have a reservation? I made this, we don't have a reservation. Well, hold on just a minute. Goes and talks to somebody. We've got a couple rooms, though, that you might could have. There was one of those rooms where the train is literally 5 feet behind it that comes through about every 20 minutes, There's only 3 rooms like that, and they never book them. 2 of them are full of towels and that sort of thing. I'm like, I'll take it. I don't want to go back out. So I give him the money, and he says, oh, by the way, my granddaughter's birthday party's starting in about 10 minutes. You're invited. I said, great. I was hungry. It's 10 o'clock at night. I didn't think I was going to have dinner. So I run to my room. I get a bath, come back out to this pool that has, 4 Greek goddesses built around the pool. They've got a buffet table for his 11-year-old little girl, and all of the family's out, and they've got a couple of guitar players, and I'm going through line getting my food, and I hear somebody in English say, Cullman, Alabama. And I leave the line and just start walking. Cullman, Alabama. Cullman, Alabama. Who is this from Cullman, Alabama? Well, long story short, there was a young woman there from Cullman who had married an archaeologist, and they were there on their last night doing a dig in Pompeii. And I talked to their group for a little while. Well, there's 3 points that I want to pull from this little story is, whenever you start talking about foreign travel, there's 3 things you need to keep in mind. Number 1, you need to pray. You need to pray a lot and realize that you're at the mercy of God. Number 2, you need to stay calm and be patient. Just go along with the process. The process is going to be whatever the process is. One time I flew into the Philippines, and while I was in the air, the price of gas had gone up 200%. And guess what? The people were not happy when we arrived, and we just had to go with the flow. Just like you were talking about when you were in Bangladesh just a few weeks ago. You just had to say, well, let's adjust. Let's figure out what needs to happen. And the third thing is just that adjustment. You have to be flexible, and you talked about that quite a bit. You have to be flexible. I remember talking to a guy who told me that 5 out of 7 nights a week, he and his wife eat Texas toast and chicken tenders for dinner, and he wanted to do mission work. And I said, well, you're going to have to start learning to eat a few more things if you want to do, So you have to be flexible. I was in Peru just a week and a half ago, and the guy I was with, our host had said, well, we're going to start class at 10 o'clock, and that was in 15 minutes. Well, my friend got up about 9:50 and said, well, let's go. It's time to teach class in 10 minutes. And I said, hold on. We will teach class when they say that we're going to go teach class. We just... they may say we're going to start at 10 o'clock, but, 10 o'clock is whatever they decide 10 o'clock is going to be. So those 3 things, if you forget everything else that I say when you're talking about travel, just those 3 things will get you through, okay? Pray and realize that this is God's work. Be flexible in what you're doing and just stay calm and just go with the pace, go with the flow, whatever it may be. Let me give just a few more things, and I'll have to speed up just a little bit. Another quick little story. My family had a chance to move to Germany very briefly just a couple of years ago, and when we were moving, we had everything that we were going to have with us while we lived there. So we all had about 4 suitcases. It was a little more than could be carried on its own, and we were supposed to be taken directly to our house where we were going to be staying. So we were moving to a little town called Lappersdorf, and the street we were moving to was Regensburger Strasse. Okay? So the taxi, I'd figured it all out. Once again, impeccably planned, And so the taxi was going to take us straight from the airport, an hour and a half to the apartment, to the flat. So we get out, and I walk up to the door, knock on it, and a lady with a very angry grimace on her face opens the door, and I say, we're here. And she says, who are you? She's like, this is the wrong place, and she shuts the door, and I go back to the street, and it's starting to sprinkle. I'm like, well, Robin, and here we are, jet lag, we've got all this luggage with us, and I'm trying to figure out how to say in a different way,
this is not the right place. But I know I can't say this is not the right place, you know. And so I'm like, well, there must be a mistake. So I go back to the door again and I knock again, you know. You know, this time she's like, this is not it, you know. So at that point, I went back to the luggage and I said, well, you're just going to have to stay here with the kids for just a minute. There's a little business right down here. Let me go down there and see if I can use their phone. So I go down there and I call the people, and it turns out we were 1 mile away. And the funny thing was, remember, we were moving to Loppersdorf on Regensburg Street. Well, we were actually in the city of Regensburg on Loppersdorf Street. And if you go 1 mile, the names switch. And therein lies the problem. So, you know, that was sort of our experience. I remember one of the first missionary books I ever read was Betty Choate's book, First Steps in Faith. And I love that book. You know, it just taught me so much. But there's one thing I never understood about First Steps of Faith. Betty would write something like, JC went out this morning to turn on the phones. 7 hours later, JC came home and the phones have not been turned on. And the office said, come back tomorrow. You know, and this would go on for weeks. I'm like, I was just sitting there trying to figure it out. I know JC's not incompetent. I know he's not stupid. I know Betty's not either. Why can't they turn the phone on? You know, and I didn't understand that until I've gone to the same office 4 times in a row just to get them to say, just so I can say, I'm here. I'm living here in your city. And they're like, well, you'll have to come back and tell us tomorrow because you don't have such and such document. I'm like, okay, fine. You know, I'd come back at the end of the day, Robin, well, I didn't get us registered today. You're going to have to come tomorrow with the kids too because they don't believe there's 4 of us. You know, these things like that. Now, the reason I'm telling you about this actually does have a point specifically because we're talking about beachhead missions, and there's a lot of things that go into beachhead missions, also known as long-term missions. There's a lot of hilarious little details that go from basically trying to climatize to a new country. And I would like to point you to this book right here, Mission Training Manual, Wayne Barrier, my mother as well. They spent a lot of time putting this together, but they also consulted with dozens of missionaries who also put input into this book as well. And so there's a chapter in here that you might want to check out that has to do with logistics and foreign travel for world evangelism. And so when I turn over to page 117, which is where the chapter begins, there are just a number of things that need to be thought through. And there's a number of ways that you can tackle thinking through these things. Passport and visa requirements, travel arrangements, money exchange, personal finances, housing, health issues, communication, and then there's other things as well, clothing, food, and such things as that. So I'm not going to go through all of those details in particular because, to be honest, it's probably not relevant to go through them now, but if you're going to be moving somewhere, you might want to talk about it. But and read those things in fine detail. And then also dig into a lot of other sources. You know, most universities around the world have centers set up to help people to adjust. Now, they're actually set up to help their own students adjust to that culture or that climate. But they also have a lot of resources as well once you get there that has to do with the local terrain of where you're talking about. But this fits into a category that we call long-term missions where traditionally a family might move somewhere to establish a church. I like to call it beachhead missions. This is something my dad and I have talked about a lot, and my family, where if you think about, if there is no presence of the church in a particular country, and you're needing to create that presence, it's kind of like a beachhead effort. You've landed on the beach, and there's so much going against you being there, trying to push you off of that beach. It takes certain types of skills and ideas to be able to do that, to be able to stay there. You understand what I'm saying? And so there's actually a high fatality rate. Not really people dying, but I'm going with the metaphor. It's very hard to succeed doing that. Do you understand what I'm saying? A lot of people will fail doing that. But things are beginning to change as well. Short-term missions is something we're familiar with too, which I consider, this is my designations, okay? It's a subsidiary or reinforcement for long-term missions. And typically this will involve people from our home country who will go visit these places, and they'll do some work there, and then they will come home, but there's not actually a long-term relationship between the person here and what's going on over there. So we call it short-term missions. This is what I consider a really good way to educate people about what's involved in God's mission around the world. It's a good way to see it. But I think that we can go even further with that, and we're going to get into some of this just a little bit more. But when we talk about these types of trips, sometimes we take our family, and that's always got all kinds of logistical issues related to that as well. Kids crying or screaming, or they won't go to sleep on the airplane and things like that, or they're having trouble adjusting, or they've been thrown into a school because you couldn't get them into this school, and there's all kinds of stuff that you end up having to think about. And the odds of success are lower. You know, and the way you do it makes a big difference. Another book I read, and the mission training manual is right back here, in case you're wondering. And you need to read books by experienced missionaries. You know, I remember I was reading a book called Putting Out the Fleece, and the name is slipping my mind on who wrote that right now, but the missionary and his wife, when they moved to Africa, because they made some logistical errors, they lost their firstborn child. Health concerns. And what was sad about it is they said in the book it was preventable. They just made quick decisions and didn't think through it. So the way you actually go through these logistics is critical. It's very important because you can make mistakes that create scars that you can never recover from them. You know, I was thinking about, I had a huge support team for my family going into Germany. Robin had a high school friend who moved to Germany at the same time that we did. Her friend had an awful experience. She was mugged 3 times within the first 6 months because of logistical issues. You see what I'm saying? We weren't mugged. Now, I'm not saying we're favored. That's not my point. What I'm saying is we were going by textbook stuff that said, try to do this, don't do this. It doesn't mean it's easy. It just means you're not making needless mistakes. And so those types of things need to be thought through. But, you know, missions is starting to change in some very specific ways. Communication capabilities are changing so quickly that we're no longer seeing people who are just 50 years ago who are getting on the boat or getting on the plane, and then we don't see them for years. That's not happening. I was laughing with my dad once again, who, when I talked to him Friday, between the two of us, we had been around the globe 1.5 times since we had last spoken, you know. And that's happening more and more, and it's becoming easier and easier because travel is becoming extremely efficient and affordable at the same time. Telephones are completely changing communications in many, many ways, for the better and some ways for the worse as well. But I can schedule meetings with coworkers at any part of the globe, at any time, at no cost. And so, you know, that's having a massive impact on the way we think about things. As I said, travel's changing pretty dramatically too. Capitalism, did I spell that right? Yeah, okay. You know, it's really dramatically changing things because, you know, Coca-Cola's been there. Coca-Cola's been there. Now, we're not trying to take advantage of this and say that we don't want to respect other cultures, but what I'm trying to say is, if you're not aware of it, we're actually merging into a global economy and we're merging into a global culture. People in China are dramatically studying and intensely studying what language? They're studying English. Like I said, it doesn't mean we don't ignore cultures. We're not there yet, but it is rapidly changing. Just 2 weeks ago, I saw a lady who has spent her life, who doesn't even have electricity in her home, and she farms every day of her life, very simple life, and she pulls out her cell phone, you know. It's changing, and it's having an impact. So, places like this in India, they bring you out Coca-Cola. They've heard of it, But the other thing, probably the big one, is globalization. And this is what I'm talking about, where people, more and more, we're seeing this. There's basically a fight taking place between different cultures, and different cultures are winning out. And it just so happens that the American educational system is winning out globally. Countries even like Germany, which are considered equals, have completely overhauled their educational systems to model it after ours. People in schools around the entire globe are learning English at the primary levels. So this is having a huge impact on communication capabilities. But not only this, we're now experiencing a situation where we have native workers and native Christians in basically every country of the world, save about 5 or 6. Let me say that again. We have native workers for the church in every nation, save 5 or 6. Now, we may still disagree on the way what we think about a fellowship hall or something like that. But there are people at the ground level almost everywhere we go that we can meet with and worship with and talk with and figure out how to come up with plans and strategies and work together. And then when I get back home, I can still talk to them. I don't just have to see them face to face for a couple days. And this is what we're talking about, where we have strategic long-term missions, often confused with short-term missions. This is not a technical term, okay? I'm just throwing this up here, But what we're talking about is where we're able to strategize and work with people from here. Now, if you go back about 50 or 60 years, you used to have somebody who would move into another country, and they would stay there, and they would write letters back and forth. And oftentimes they would have an individual or a couple of individuals within a congregation that would go around and do fundraising for them and do communications for them and sort of help them strategically. But that's actually changed, where now we have people who have spent 10, 20, 30 years living in the field, moving back to the United States, and they're very quickly adapting this capability of going back and forth. And they're working with natives in their homelands. And that's different. We're talking about things that we don't have a lot of precedent for. But hey, that's where we are. We're at the cusp of that. No longer do I have to just go somewhere and sort of do a one-off, one-week evangelism with them. I can go back home and then call them when I get back home, or shoot them an email. Or we can talk about some things that we have in common. We can talk about global events that we all know about because communications have changed. Now, let me make sure you understand this. Biblical principles that we use aren't changing, but the applications are changing. The applications are changing. So I might look at Paul and see that Paul would write a letter, Colossians chapter 4, verse 16, 17, and he would ask the church at Colossae to pass that letter around, kind of have it copied and sent around. That's mass evangelism in a nutshell, But now when we start applying that, we're like, well, we can use radio. That's a way of multiplying something I say. We can print stuff. We can, just a handout. That's mass evangelism. That's technology that Paul didn't even have. A photocopy. So, that's really having a pretty big impact. And here I want to give you all something right here too. And I have I already gave it to you. You've already read it. Okay. This is something I use when I'm talking about strategic long-term missions, where I'm making trips to and coming and going to places. And we're not the only people doing this. I talked to a guy Friday here on campus who owns companies in China. You understand what I'm saying? He goes over to China a few times a year and he meets with his coworkers. And they have a new set of problems, I understand that. But we're not the only people experiencing globalization. And so we can talk to our friends and our coworkers in all different fields and see how they're dealing with it. So when I make a trip, this is my little list, and the guy that I just traveled with, I've never had anybody actually go by this list except for me and a couple other people, you know, and so he went by this list, and he was packed lighter than I was. And the goal is to pack light because you're just going in, getting down to business, and then going back home, you know. And the funny thing is he left 25% of everything that he brought with him. So he could have even gone lighter. And all he had was a backpack and another little shoulder bag. But you can actually go somewhere, pack very light. And the big kicker about this is something that's very difficult for us to adjust to. This assumes that you have everything that you need that you would have to have access to within 24 hours. But if you had some serious medical emergency, well, you've got to have a bigger plan than that. You know, either going to fly you out. Joey was telling me about his medical plan in Burma after he had gone to the hospital there and realized he needed an extensive medical plan in case he ever had a serious injury. But, you know, you can't account for that with a little packing list like this. But this will get you there, but if you're sick and it's significant enough, well, you're going to have to go see a pharmacist. You know. And notice I say you're going to have to go see a pharmacist. In a lot of these places, you can self-medicate pretty easily. I'm not encouraging you to do that without counsel. But you can figure out what you need to do wherever you go. And we can talk about those lists too, but it's, you know, just a lot of real practical stuff. You know, but the big things that almost catch me are right before I leave. You know, right before I left to go on this trip, I was going down my list one more time, and I had not packed my passport. You know, of all the things, you know. I've got credit cards in case I need emergency plans and blah, blah, blah. You know, but just kind of make sure you hit all the details and use this. And I think it'll serve you well. You can always build on it, you know, if you needed to. All right, we're doing real good. We're about done. Let me tell you just a real quick story about this man in Vietnam. He's about 94. We started traveling into Vietnam, me and a number of other people that we work with, going into Vietnam and to try to encourage the church. I'd talk to my brother and I'd talk to my parents, and we'd talk to some Filipino brethren, Neil's family, and some others as well. And you know, politically and economically, everything was lining up for us to start going back into Vietnam to see if we could help the church. You know, when they first started to reopen in the late 90s, a long-term missionary there by the name of Leonard Blake actually went back to try to follow up on some of his friends and relations that he had, and it didn't take very long at all that he had been taken by the police and kicked out of the country and told you can't come back for a decade. So everybody just kind of sat back for a little bit. There was a man here, T.J. Hughes, along with the president of Heritage, who went in not long after that, but they went in under the guise of business interest. I mean, it truly was business interest, but they wanted to visit the church while they were there too, and they did so. Visited with the Christians. But slowly, it took about 5 more years till people started saying, you know, let's try to go back in there. And there was just a handful of people doing it. So we went over to visit some of these Christians too. They connected us with a church in Ho Chi Minh City, and so we did. And we started emailing with them. And then we go in and we would do training, we'd do teaching. Every year that we've gone there, we've had an attempted intervention by the government. They've been successful about 3/4 of the time in disrupting what we've been doing. And so it's very trying, it's very slow. We've seen the church double in size in Vietnam since we've been able to get involved with them and meeting with them. There have been a couple different people who have moved into Vietnam to try to help. One an Indian brother, another an American brother. The Indian has left and the American has passed away. And so we just kind of do what we can, you know, and helping this church to grow. But I remember sitting down with him for the first time, and he was one of the members who, in 1975, after the fall of Saigon, he and his business partner took the congregation out of Saigon to protect them from violence. And they moved them out into the country, and they all relocated there, and they were farmers. And they were growing soybeans. And they were turning it into tofu and selling it at the marketplace. So he and his business partner did this, and the church continued to meet. And then his business partner, he had a son. His son's name is Dong, and that's him right behind him, right there. Around 1985, Dong was old enough that he made the decision that he also wanted to preach. He started to preach, and his preaching was immediately greeted by a jail sentence with immediate re-education involved by the government. He went through that, got out, continued to preach. At that point, the government had a housing program where people, under their government plan, they will build small houses for people and set them up on small farms. But they came to Dong and they said, Dong, I want you to know that anybody who comes and worships with you, we have told them they will be severed from all government subsidies. No houses, no food, nothing. So Dong said, thank you for the notification. He kept preaching, they kept coming. What did they do? They clung together and figured out how to deal with their own stuff. So at that point, the government realized that they weren't having any traction, and the government was not disposed to just want to be needlessly violent to them. They weren't actually disturbers of the peace. So they just cut off their subsidies and said, basically, you'll be on your own. They've been that way to this day. They even have a website. It's against the law, but they have a website to promote the church being there. And they continue to work in the community, and they're still there. They've started other congregations. We're still seeing baptisms, and Dong's son, who's now about 25 years old, has been trained in the Philippines. He's been trained in Singapore, and he's preaching too. And he's preaching for that community. And I remember when we sat down with this brother right here, he says, he said, we've been through many things, and we've been waiting for a long time to the day that you could come back and we could work together. Will you work with us? And we will. We will. So when you start thinking about, when I start talking about these ideas about long-term strategic planning, what that means is because the communications have changed, because travel has changed, because it's affordable, because we live in a global environment, because we have people in Vietnam who, when I show up, know English now, because it's beneficial to them, not because I'm trying to anglicize them. You understand what I'm saying? All of these situations line up because I can email with them on any given day and talk with them. We're put into a situation where we can be thinking now, right here. We don't need to save it for the field. You see what I'm saying? Now, I don't know exactly how the plan looks. By and large, there's other rules that go into this. The plan needs to go according to whatever they think the plan ought to look like for their own country. Because, what's happened here that's different than what we've seen in many places, these people are now becoming the beachhead mission efforts. These are the ones who are leading the troops forward. And they're within the culture. And the relationship we have with them becomes critically important on how we manage it, and how we deal with people. But it's an opportunity that I think that we can't turn away from either. When people look at you and say, this is where we are. This is what's happening. So I think you can get involved in a number of different ways, and I encourage you to do so. And I hope that along the way that if you do make a trip where you just go visit a place, be mindful of them. Think about what they're thinking about. Think about the circumstances they're dealing with. I appreciate Mike Brooks' comments. When he had to leave Bangladesh, it was true that he was risking his own safety, But the question that comes to his mind is how many people, other than me, safety is being, put into consideration here. He doesn't want to risk other people's lives too. So we need to be thoughtful. And the thing about it is we have so many resources now that if you have a burning desire to help the church in China, you can dig into it with all kinds of information. There's no reason right now that we should go anywhere ill-equipped on information. We should find out that information and make wise decisions. And then I think that opportunities like this help service that, where we're connecting people with other people so that we can continue to follow up it. And that's exactly what the retreat's for, where you can connect with other people and go in and make wise decisions. The list that I gave you is not my list. You understand what I'm saying? It's a compilation of things that are passed on and fine-tuned. What's my contribution? I think instead of a camera, I changed it to an iPod. Or do you understand what I'm saying? That maybe that's a new one for you. But otherwise, it's things being passed on. So do you have questions or comments? We have about 5 minutes or 7 minutes if we want to use it.
Do you find knowing the history of where you're going help with
I do. It's help. Usually, one of the things that I do for fun whenever I travel somewhere is I'll grab a book that has to do with the history of some country and read it along the way. And it's useful in a couple ways. One, it will help you jump into their culture. And then when you're given that sermon, if you're able to bring out one little bit of illustration from something you learned from it, it goes a long way with people realizing that you actually appreciate them and you appreciate where they're from. If you can say hello and just really fumble it, that's better than not trying at all, So I guess it's just a basic, to me it's a basic way to kind of understand what you're getting into. Especially, there's one real important way that it helps us. If you go back about 120 years, 80% of the world was a colony of about 2 or 3 nations, more or less. 80%. So what that means is most places you're going to go into are either going to resent you or the French or Great Britain. Okay? And that's going to be an underlying bedrock principle of their society. So when you come in and you say, hey, let's talk business, you know what business means. Okay, how are you going to put your foot on my neck again? That's what it oftentimes is going to be interpreted. So just knowing that, and the problem, and the reason that's important too is many times missionaries going into countries are actually still doing that. And they don't even realize it. Because the people that they're talking to have been taught from generation to generation to know how to deal with a colonizer or the empire. So when you go in and you actually treat people as shoulder to shoulder or you treat them respectfully, in some cases you're actually setting a precedent that they may not be used to, but it's really important too. But when you start looking at the history of a place, that becomes real important. So for instance, many of these places, you just take Vietnam for instance, who had difficult times with us, and before us they had difficult times with the French, and before that, they had other difficult, there's a number of different people who've come in, and the Chinese, they've had difficult with the Chinese as well. So a lot of these places go back generation after generation after generation. And it's not your fault, it has nothing to do with me or you. It just means that we're not the first people to show up,
They end up developing other people. You actually have an entirely different dynamic of growth when you follow that model, because they're providing the leadership and their communications are so much better, their understanding of the culture, all those things are much better. So if we can learn to do that, I think we can get to a lot of these places in the world where we're not getting to them today. That's one of our big problems. We don't have anybody willing to do anything in most of the world today. We talked about, half the world is China, India, and the countries that surround it. 1-2% will be believers of any kind. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. We could do a lot more, I think, if we learn how to do this strategic model that you actually got people who have jobs here, make a living, that can still be very productive missionaries traveling for short periods of time, several times a year. If we use the beachhead that's already been established, that has to happen. You can't do anything unless you have people there that are at a certain level of development.
Right.
And most of them, many places they are at that point.
I don't want to talk too much, I've had my time. One of the really good things that can be done on short-term mission is very focused workshops that are culturally appropriate. I was in Moscow and talked to James West, and he said that Americans would announce they were coming to do campaigns and so forth. And he said some of the local members came to him in Moscow and said, James, when are we going to do something besides the Book of Acts? Said, we've been through the Book of Acts 4 times. None of the people who came here and asked what's been done before and what do you really need. And so to have seasoned teachers or preachers who are prepared to go into some of these places and to conduct workshops, training on very focused needs, that could be a good use of short-term work and really advance the local cause.
Excellent. We'll go ahead and call it to an end. Continue the discussion when we're done. As many as, thank you very much. Thank you, Jeremy. Would y'all agree that we have all been blessed by being here tonight? This has been so good. I appreciate all the comments. I appreciate this good discussion. As Jeremy said, we don't have to stop. And those who want to stay here all night and talk about this, we can. I really like a lot of the things that both of you said. I like what Brother Slade said when you said sustained. Sustained work. I think that's what however you want to do this, it needs to be sustained. And I think that we all got that from it. So I appreciate everything that y'all have said. And thank you so much for being here. That is the purpose of the Center for Missions Training and Information, is what has just happened tonight. Older missionaries and younger missionaries, but very experienced missionaries imparting wisdom, and we can all learn from this. It's motivating and it inspires me to continue in this work. Let's end with a prayer. Our Father in heaven, we thank you so much for this day. We thank you for everything that you've done for us. We thank you that you sent your Son into this world. He lived and died for us. God, we pray that we can get that message to all the world. We thank you so much for Brother Slade and Jeremy for coming here tonight to talk to us about how to do this job more effectively, how to get to other places, how to do this job efficiently, effectively, and to reach as many people as we possibly can. God, we love you. We thank you so much for Jesus. We ask for your guidance, your wisdom, and we ask all these things in Jesus' name.